Humans shared heat with the dying alien girl, and her people marked him as a forbidden savior. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Commander John Mitchell stepped off the shuttle and into the frozen landscape of the distant planet, his boots crunching in the deep snow. The air was thin and biting, colder than anything he had ever experienced in his 25 years of military service. His breath formed icy clouds in the air as he adjusted the collar of his thick coat. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: survey a potential mining site and report back. But when the shuttle's navigation system malfunctioned, he found himself stranded on this desolate world with a broken radio, no backup, and no way to communicate with his team. He had no choice but to venture out, hoping to find shelter and make it back to base before the storm made things worse. As he trudged through the snow, he stumbled upon something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A figure lay half buried in the snow, a woman. Her skin was a pale violet, almost translucent in the harsh light of the frozen sun. Her hair, silver and flowing like liquid metal, was tangled around her face, and her limbs appeared frozen, lifeless. John approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. She was an alien, a species he'd only read about in the most classified of documents. Her kind was known for their harsh survival instincts, their ability to withstand extreme conditions, but she looked far from the imposing figure described in the reports. The sight of her frailty hit him hard. He kneeled down beside her, hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed the snow away from her face. Her eyes flickered open, revealing iridescent pupils that seemed to pierce through him. She gasped, weakly lifting her head, and her voice, though hoarse, was clear. "Help me," she whispered, her breath ragged. John's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't a medic, but he knew enough to recognize the signs of a dying body. She had to be freezing, close to death. He acted without thinking, wrapping his arms around her to keep her warm. As he held her against his chest, the cold seemed to penetrate his own body, but he refused to let go. He couldn't let her die out here. He shared his body heat with her as best as he could, trying to keep her alive. The alien woman's body trembled in his arms, but her breathing began to steady. As the minutes passed, John's mind raced. He had no idea who she was or why she was out here in the first place, but he knew that saving her could change everything. He had no idea, though, that this simple act of kindness would mark him forever in her people's eyes. She slowly opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze. There was something in her expression that was impossible to read, something between gratitude and confusion. "You," she began, her voice shaky but stronger now. "You saved me. But you don't understand. In my culture, you've broken a law." John frowned, still cradling her in his arms. "What law?" he asked, the concern for her still outweighing the confusion. She shook her head weakly. "You are not allowed to touch me. It is forbidden for your kind to share warmth with mine. You are a forbidden savior." John didn't fully understand, but the last thing on his mind was the culture or the rules of this alien race. All that mattered now was keeping her alive. "We'll figure it out later," he said, trying to reassure her. The storm was worsening, and he knew they needed to find shelter before it became impossible to survive. But as they sat together in the freezing cold, huddled for warmth, John had no idea just how much this decision would change both of their lives, and how it would mark him as an outcast in her society. Little did he know, his compassion would soon become a story spoken of in whispers among her people, a story of a human who saved an alien and was cursed with a title that could never be spoken aloud. As the storm raged outside, John Mitchell and the alien woman, Elira, huddled together in the makeshift shelter he had managed to find. The walls of the cave trembled with each gust of wind, but the shelter provided a brief respite from the biting cold that threatened to overtake them. John sat with his back to the wall, still holding Elira close, trying to maintain the warmth he had given her. His breath was shallow, each exhale forming icy clouds in the freezing air, but he didn't care. What mattered now was her survival. Elira's body was still cold, though not as lifeless as before. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her violet skin gradually losing its paleness as the warmth of his body spread through her. He could feel the slight tremors in her body as she leaned against him, and he knew she was still on the edge of death. She turned her head slightly, her silver hair shifting, and looked up at him with those striking blue eyes that seemed to pierce through him. You don't know what you've done, she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. John's brow furrowed, confusion still swirling in his mind. What do you mean? He asked quietly, trying not to disturb the fragile silence of the moment. She shifted slightly, taking in a deep breath. In my culture, you're kind. You're not supposed to save mine. Not like this. It's forbidden. You've broken the rules. John wasn't sure what to say. The idea that his simple act of kindness could break some alien law seemed absurd to him. He hadn't done it for any reason other than to help her. He wasn't thinking about cultural norms or boundaries, he was thinking about saving a life. Elira sighed, her head resting on his shoulder now as she closed her eyes. You're not just a stranger to me now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're a savior, but a savior that my people cannot acknowledge. You have to understand. What you've done, they'll never let it go. John's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. She wasn't talking about gratitude. She wasn't talking about kindness. She was talking about something deeper, something that seemed to carry with it a weight he couldn't even begin to grasp. What will they do? He asked, his voice tight with concern. He had no idea who they were, Elira's people, her society, her culture. But whatever power they held, whatever rules governed them, John knew he was now entangled in something far beyond his understanding. I don't know, Elira replied softly, her voice thick with emotion. But if they find out what you've done, they will mark you. Mark you as something forbidden. John didn't fully understand, but he could see the fear in her eyes. The fear wasn't just for herself, it was for him. She was worried about what would happen if her people learned that he had saved her life. That he had broken their rules. They both knew that whatever came next, it would not be simple. I didn't ask for this, John muttered, glancing down at her fragile form. I just wanted to keep you alive. Elira looked up at him again, her eyes glinting with a mixture of sadness and something else he couldn't quite place. I know, she whispered. But you've done more than keep me alive. You've changed everything. There was a long silence between them, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside the cave. John's heart was heavy with the weight of her words. He had no idea what kind of consequences awaited him. No idea what kind of price he would have to pay for this simple act of warmth, of humanity. But one thing was certain, his life, and Elira's, would never be the same. As the storm continued to rage outside, John and Elira sat together, each lost in their own thoughts, but united by the knowledge that something far more significant had begun, a bond between two beings from different worlds, a bond that could never be undone. Days passed, and John Mitchell found himself struggling to come to terms with the new reality that surrounded him. The storm had subsided, but the landscape was still harsh and unforgiving, a mirror to the turmoil inside his mind. Elira, though still weak, had recovered enough to sit up and speak with him. Her alien physiology was resilient, but the mental and emotional toll of what had happened seemed to weigh heavily on her. You still don't understand, do you? She asked, her violet eyes watching him intently. John was sitting across from her, his body stiff from the cold, but he couldn't pull his gaze away from her. I'm trying to, he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the dry air and lack of sleep. But this whole thing is just too much. You said I saved you, but what does that mean for me? For you? Elira sighed deeply, a sound filled with regret and resignation. It means everything has changed, she said softly. And it means nothing will be the same again, for either of us. You are a savior in my eyes, but that's forbidden. In my culture, the act you've performed is not one that can be acknowledged. John ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because you were dying. I couldn't just let you die out there. Elira looked at him with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Your compassion is beyond what anyone could have expected. But that's the problem. My people, they don't see compassion the way you do. To them, an outsider, especially a human, interfering in our lives like this is seen as an act of rebellion. It's a breaking of the natural order. John shook his head, trying to understand. But I wasn't trying to start a rebellion. I was just trying to keep you alive. How is that a rebellion? Elira's lips parted, and for a moment, she seemed to be searching for the right words. Because where I come from, life is controlled. Every act, every decision, is governed by rules. Our people believe that the preservation of life is not something to be tampered with. We were not meant to mix in this way. Humans in my kind, we do not share warmth, we do not share kindness, it is a violation of who we are. John stood up, pacing the small cave, trying to make sense of what she was saying. It all felt like a bad dream, an impossible situation he couldn't quite escape. But you're here, and you're alive, he muttered, shaking his head. What does it matter if we're breaking some rule? You needed help, and I gave it. That's all there is to it. Elira's eyes softened, and she looked away, lost in thought. You don't understand the consequences of your actions, John. You've given me more than warmth. You've given me hope. And hope is dangerous. John stopped, his body stiffening. Dangerous, he repeated, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. Why would hope be dangerous? Elira met his gaze again, her voice low and filled with emotion. Because hope means change. And change means the old ways are no longer enough. My people, my society, will not accept this. They cannot. John sat back down beside her, the weight of her words sinking in. So what happens now? Do we just wait for them to come and what, punish us? Elira's gaze turned distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the walls of the cave. No. They won't come for us, not right away. But they will know. The moment I return to my people, the moment I step foot in our sacred lands again, the truth will spread. And when it does, they will decide our fates. And they will not be kind. John let out a slow breath, the reality of the situation setting in. They were no longer just two survivors of a storm. They were now entangled in something far larger than either of them. The weight of what they had done hung heavily between them, and there was no easy way out. Then we run, John said, his voice firm with resolve. We leave this planet. We find somewhere else. Somewhere where your people won't find us. Elira shook her head gently. It's not that simple. There's nowhere for us to run where they won't find us. They will track us down. They have ways. John clenched his fists, frustrated with the limitations he felt. So we fight. If they come for us, we fight. Elira met his gaze once more, her eyes soft but sad. You don't understand. This is not a battle you can win. This is a fight against tradition. Against belief. You can't fight a culture that has existed for millennia. The air between them felt heavy, thick with the weight of their hopelessness. But in that silence, something else grew, something neither of them had expected. A bond that went beyond survival, beyond warmth. A bond that couldn't be broken, no matter the consequences. The days continued to pass, and John Mitchell and Elira remained in the cave, bound by the shared warmth and a growing, unspoken connection that neither of them fully understood. The outside world seemed a distant memory, and the storm that had once ravaged the land was now just a soft whisper against the walls of their shelter. But the tension between them, an unacknowledged tension, lingered, as though they were caught in a moment that could not last forever. John had thought that helping Elira would be the end of it. He hadn't considered that his actions would have consequences. His simple decision to share his warmth had irrevocably changed the course of both their lives. But how could he have known? How could he have anticipated the weight of tradition and belief that held such power over Elira's people? He hadn't signed up for any of this, and yet, here he was, entangled in a situation that felt like a slow-moving storm, inevitable and dangerous. You're quiet today, Elira said, her voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. She was sitting near the cave entrance, her violet skin shimmering faintly in the dim light, her silver hair still tangled from the storm, but now, it was softer, more controlled. She had regained her strength, though not yet fully. John looked over at her, still unsure of how to process everything. He sat with his back against the wall, his arms crossed, staring into the distance. "I'm just thinking," he muttered, not sure if he even had the right words to explain his feelings. Elira nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving him. "About what?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. John hesitated, but there was something about her gaze, something that made him feel like he could trust her. "About the mess I've gotten myself into," he said, finally speaking the truth that had been sitting heavily in his chest. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to survive. Help you survive." Elira's expression softened, and for the first time, John saw a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. "I understand," she said quietly. "But you cannot change what has happened. What you did, it's already been marked. It cannot be undone." John ran a hand through his hair, frustration building again. "I don't care about what's been marked. I care about what happens next. What happens to you, to me, to us?" Elira was silent for a moment, her gaze turned inward, as though she were weighing something far beyond the two of them. "You think you can change everything," she said, almost to herself. "But sometimes, things are meant to be as they are. You're telling me there's no way out?" John's voice cracked with disbelief. Elira's gaze flickered up to meet his, her expression unreadable. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm telling you that some things cannot be changed, no matter how hard we try. My people, they will never accept what we've done." John stood up abruptly, his movements sharp and full of frustration. "Then I'll leave," he said, his voice rising. "I'll leave this planet, and I'll find a way to get back to Earth. I don't have to stay here." Elira didn't flinch at his outburst. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movements graceful despite her still fragile state. "You can leave," she said softly, "but it will follow you. And one day, when you least expect it, they will come. And they will find you." John stared at her, a mix of disbelief and anger filling his chest. "Who will find me? Your people? For what? A crime I didn't know existed?" Elira took a step closer to him, her expression distant but calm. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For a crime you didn't know existed. For a bond that should never have been formed." The words hit John like a slap. It didn't make sense. He hadn't known what he was doing, how could he have? He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't trained to understand alien customs or laws. All he knew was that a life was slipping away in front of him, and he couldn't stand by and let it happen. "I didn't mean to start a war," he muttered, his voice raw with emotion. Elira didn't answer immediately. She stepped back, her hand resting lightly against the stone wall of the cave. "It's not a war," she said quietly, "but it will feel like one. Not now, not tomorrow, but eventually. It's the way of things." John's chest tightened. He couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't just sit here, trapped in this cave, waiting for the consequences of an act that had been nothing but kindness. "There has to be a way," he said, almost to himself. Elira turned away from him, walking toward the cave entrance. "There is," she said, her voice steady but filled with resignation. "But it will cost more than you think." John watched her, feeling the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. He had already paid the price for saving her once. But would he be willing to pay it again? John Mitchell stood by the entrance of the cave, his mind racing with Elira's words. "It will cost more than you think." He could feel the weight of the promise she had just made, whatever it was, he knew it would be something he wasn't ready for. But he couldn't just walk away. Not now, not after everything. He looked at Elira, who was standing near the cave's edge, gazing out into the distance. The last few days had been nothing but silence, their bond growing yet fragile, constantly on the verge of unraveling. Her words had only deepened the uncertainty that now clouded his thoughts. He had never imagined that helping someone, especially someone from another world, would lead to such consequences. He had just acted on instinct, a human instinct to help when help was needed. He didn't care about the laws of her people, their culture. All he cared about was saving her life. And now, that decision had placed both of them in a situation they couldn't escape. "Elira," John said, his voice steady but carrying a trace of urgency. "What do you mean by it will cost more than I think? What is it that we have to do? I need to know." Elira's gaze remained distant for a long moment before she turned back to face him. Her violet eyes seemed to carry a weight, as though she were balancing the truth against the fear of what might come next. "You will have to leave this place," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You will have to return to your people and tell them the truth. That's the only way to make it stop." John's heart sank. Return to Earth? He didn't know if he could go back to Earth, not after everything that had happened. He had barely survived on this alien planet, let alone risk the journey back to a world that might never understand what he had done. Elira nodded slowly. "Yes. The truth must be spoken, even if it means they will hunt you. Your people must know that you saved me, that you broke the rules." John clenched his fists, trying to keep his anger in check. "Why does it have to be this way? Why can't we just move on, leave all of this behind?" Elira stepped forward, her voice softening. "Because the moment they know, they will see you as a threat. They will see you as a symbol of rebellion. And they won't stop until they find you, until they make an example of you. That's the cost." John took a deep breath, fighting the frustration building inside him. "So, that's it. We just give up and let them do whatever they want?" Elira's gaze softened, but there was still a sadness in her eyes. "No, John. You don't understand. It's not about giving up. It's about survival. It's about making sure that what you did doesn't destroy everything else." The cave was silent for a long moment, the cold creeping in as the wind howled outside. John felt the weight of Elira's words press down on him, each one a reminder of the impossible choice that lay before him. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had only wanted to help her. But now, that simple act of kindness had placed him in the center of a conflict that stretched far beyond his understanding. "I never wanted this," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Elira stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "I know you didn't. But sometimes, fate doesn't ask for permission. And sometimes, we don't get to choose how things unfold." John's gaze shifted to the horizon outside the cave. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had known, everything he had fought for, was slipping away. And in its place, there was something else, a responsibility, a burden, a choice that was not his own. He had no idea where this would lead, but one thing was certain, he could never undo what had already been done. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice heavy with resolve. "I'll go back to Earth. I'll tell them what happened." Elira's eyes met his, a flicker of something deep within them. "Thank you, John," she said softly. "You don't know what that means." He nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure what it meant. He didn't know if he could face his own people after everything that had happened. But one thing was clear, his journey wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. The days that followed were filled with uneasy silence. John Mitchell and Elira spent their time preparing for what was to come, the weight of their decisions hanging heavily between them. The cave, which had once been a safe refuge from the storm, now felt more like a prison, each passing moment a reminder of the impossible choice ahead. John had agreed to return to Earth, to face the consequences of his actions, but the thought of leaving Elira, of leaving this planet, was a burden that gnawed at him. "Are you ready?" Elira's voice broke through the silence, soft but steady. She was sitting near the entrance of the cave, her violet eyes watching the horizon as the sun dipped below the edge of the frozen landscape. Her body had recovered much of its strength, but there was something in her expression that told John she wasn't as at peace as she appeared. John stood up, his movements slow as he glanced around the cave one last time. The storm had passed, but he knew their time here was over. He wasn't sure what awaited him back on Earth, but he had made his decision. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for this," he replied quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. Elira didn't answer immediately. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, the fading light reflecting off her silver hair, creating a hauntingly beautiful glow. "There's no such thing as being ready," she said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. "But you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it for me, for us." John felt a pang in his chest at her words. He had never imagined that his simple act of helping her would lead to this moment. It felt like he was being forced to give up everything he had known, everything he had worked for, just to protect a bond that had no place in either of their worlds. But despite the fear and uncertainty, there was something in Elira's words that kept him from turning back. "What will happen to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elira's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't stay here forever. I will have to face my people, eventually. But you still have a chance." John shook his head, frustration rising once more. "You don't even know what I'm going back to. They'll never understand. They'll never accept it." Elira's gaze softened. "Maybe not. But you can't live your life in fear, John. You have to face them. And maybe, just maybe, they'll see the truth." John ran a hand through his hair, the weight of her words sinking in. "And if they don't?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Elira stood up, moving closer to him. "Then you fight. You fight for what's right. You fight for what you believe in." John's eyes met hers, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, he knew that. But Elira's words reminded him that he wasn't alone. They were both fighting for something, for a future neither of them could predict. "All right," he said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "I'll go back. I'll face them." Elira gave him a small nod, a look of approval crossing her face. "Then let's go." With that, John and Elira left the cave behind, stepping into the unknown together. The frozen world around them seemed to stretch endlessly, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. The journey to Earth was long and uncertain, but they would face it together, whatever awaited them at the end of the path. The journey back to Earth was not an easy one. John Mitchell and Elira traveled in silence for most of the days, the weight of their decisions hanging heavily between them. They had built a makeshift shelter to survive, keeping their supplies low and their spirits even lower. Elira had told him that there was no place to run, no place to hide, but John couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just running from the consequences of his actions, they were running from something much bigger than themselves. The thought of going back to Earth, to the people he once called family, felt like a death sentence. His mind raced with endless questions. Would they see him as a hero, a traitor, or just a fool? And what would happen to Elira, caught in the web of his own mistakes? They had been on the ship for days, the cold of the alien world still clinging to their skin, but Earth was within reach now. John could feel it, the heavy pull of gravity, the distant hum of communication signals from their world, faint but clear. Yet, despite the familiar feeling of home, he wasn't sure if he could ever return to the life he once knew. "Are you all right?" Elira's voice broke the silence, gentle yet steady. She had been quiet for a while, watching the stars as they moved past them. John turned to look at her, her violet skin illuminated by the soft glow of the ship's navigation lights. She looked exhausted, her eyes filled with an unreadable sadness. "I'm just thinking," he said, trying to focus on her, trying to push away the storm of thoughts that clouded his mind. "About what's going to happen when we land." Elira nodded slowly, understanding his fears without needing to say a word. "It won't be easy," she said softly. "But it doesn't have to be the end. You can still choose your path. You don't have to let their rules define you." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't ask for any of this, Elira. I never wanted to be caught up in whatever your people believe, and I certainly didn't ask to be marked as a forbidden savior." Elira's eyes softened. "I know. I never wanted this either. But sometimes, we don't get to choose. We don't get to choose who we save, or who saves us. We just do what we can, and deal with the consequences later." John looked out the small window of the ship, his eyes tracing the familiar sight of Earth growing larger in the distance. The blue and green of his home planet was beautiful, but it seemed more like a distant memory now. How could he ever explain this to the people he had left behind? How could he face them, knowing that the act of kindness he had extended to Elira had made him a fugitive, a traitor to both his species and hers? "I don't even know where to begin," he muttered, half to himself. Elira reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to do it alone," she said, her voice low but comforting. "I'm here. And no matter what happens, you're not the only one who has to face the consequences." John turned to her, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't name. "You don't have to come with me, Elira. You've done enough. You've already saved me by allowing me to help you." She shook her head slowly, her violet eyes locking with his. "We're in this together, John. You can't do this without me, and I can't do it without you." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the words unspoken but understood. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, a constant reminder that Earth was drawing closer with each passing second. And yet, as they neared the planet, John realized that the hardest part of their journey wasn't the distance they had traveled, it was the unknown future that awaited them, a future that was uncertain, but one they would have to navigate, no matter the cost. As the ship descended toward Earth's atmosphere, John Mitchell's heart pounded in his chest. The familiar blue and green orb grew larger in the window, but it no longer felt like the home he remembered. Everything had changed. The mission that had started as a simple exploration had become something far more complicated. Elira was seated beside him, her eyes gazing out the window, her expression unreadable. She had been quiet for most of the journey, her mind likely lost in the same whirlwind of thoughts as his. John couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they landed. Would his people understand his actions? Would they see him as a hero, or would they condemn him for something he had never meant to be? "Are you ready?" Elira's voice was soft, but there was a firmness in it that made John realize she had already come to terms with what was about to happen. He glanced at her, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. He had no idea what she was thinking, but he knew one thing: she had already accepted the consequences. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready," he replied honestly, his voice tight with anxiety. "But we don't really have a choice, do we?" Elira shook her head, the faintest of smiles playing on her lips. "No, we don't," she said. "But sometimes, we have to face what we fear the most in order to move forward." John nodded, turning his attention back to the window. Earth was just moments away now. It had been so long since he had seen it, so many years, but now it felt like a lifetime. The life he had known seemed so distant, so out of reach. He couldn't help but wonder if they would accept him, if they would understand that his actions, though driven by compassion, had now cast him into a world of uncertainty. Elira had warned him about the consequences of his actions, how his people would react. She had explained the cultural divide between them, how her people would never allow what had happened to be seen as anything but a violation of their sacred laws. But as they neared Earth, John felt a strange sense of peace. No matter what happened when they landed, no matter what the future held, he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't change what he had done. He had saved her life, and in doing so, he had changed the course of their destinies. The ship broke through the atmosphere, the heat shields glowing as they made their descent. Earth's surface was now visible, vast and sprawling, with cities, oceans, and mountains stretching below. John could feel the tension building inside him, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of calm. Elira looked at him, her expression still unreadable, but her eyes held something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. "Whatever happens, John, remember this," she said softly. "You didn't do this for any reward. You did it because you saw someone in need, and you acted. That's all that matters." Her words were simple, yet profound, and they gave John the strength he needed. He had acted from the heart, without thinking of the consequences. In that moment, he realized that no matter what happened next, he had done the right thing. They landed softly, the ship's engines humming as they touched down on Earth's soil. John felt his heart race as the ramp lowered, revealing the familiar world outside. But this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what awaited him. The world had changed, and so had he. But as he took a deep breath and stepped off the ship, he knew one thing for certain: he would face whatever came next with Elira by his side. Together, they would find a way through the storm, no matter the cost. As John and Elira stepped off the ship, the cold, crisp air of Earth hit them, a stark contrast to the warmth they had shared in the makeshift shelter on the alien planet. The bustling sounds of the city, the rush of cars, and the hum of distant conversations filled the air as they looked around, unsure of what to do next. John's heart pounded in his chest. This was Earth, the place he had once called home, but now it felt like an alien world, unfamiliar and distant. He glanced over at Elira, her violet eyes wide as she took in the sight of the city, her expression a mix of awe and confusion. "It's different," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the noise around them. "I didn't expect Earth to be so alive." John couldn't help but smile at her reaction. "It's a lot to take in," he said, trying to calm his own nerves. The weight of everything that had happened, the journey, the choices they had made, the lives they had touched, was heavy on his mind. He didn't know where to begin, or how to explain any of it. But standing here, on Earth, with Elira beside him, he realized that they had come a long way. They had both made sacrifices, taken risks, and now they had to face the consequences. "We need to find somewhere safe," John said, his voice low. "Somewhere to figure this all out." Elira nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd, the unfamiliar faces passing by without a second glance. "I don't think they'll be looking for us right away," she said, her tone cautious. "But it won't take long before they notice we're here." John glanced around, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no idea what he was walking into. Earth wasn't the same place he had left. It had been years since he had been home, and in that time, the world had changed. He had changed. But he couldn't let that stop him. "We'll figure it out," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We always do." As they made their way through the city, the noise of the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of their footsteps echoing in the streets. John kept his eyes on the path ahead, but his mind raced with a million thoughts. What would his people think when they saw him again? Would they welcome him back, or would they see him as a traitor? He had no answers, only questions. "Where do we go from here?" Elira asked, breaking the silence once more. John looked at her, the weight of her question sinking in. He didn't have an answer for her, but he knew one thing: he couldn't face this alone. They had made it this far together, and whatever came next, they would face it as a team. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we'll find a way. We have to." Elira smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Then we'll do it together." For the first time since they had landed, John felt a sense of determination rising within him. Whatever the future held, he knew they could face it. They had already come so far, and now, there was nothing left to do but take the next step forward. The city stretched out before them, full of possibilities and uncertainties, but as long as they had each other, John felt ready to face whatever came next. They walked on, side by side, the weight of the world heavy on their shoulders, but with a sense of purpose that carried them forward. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to face it, together.